I'm George غالاوي, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George غالاوي, coming to you from London with an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. We are discussing this evening the British foreign policy. The British foreign policy has been, since the rise of America's empire, to be Greece to America's Rome. Rome, the new brute power. Greece, the slightly more cultured, the slightly more intellectual, wise, and longer-standing civilization. Notwithstanding the fact that Britain and America are two countries divided by a common language, the truth is that's been Britain's foreign policy. And when we joined the European Union in 1973, our primary function, which was why the French President de Gaulle didn't want us in the European Union in the first place, was to be a US ramp inside the European community, which became the European Union. And largely, during the decades that we were members of the European Union, that's the role that we played, as a kind of guide dog for the other Europeans that were inclined, perhaps particularly the French, to be less subservient to US foreign policy. But Britain now stands at a crossroads, because in just 250 or so days from now, we'll be leaving the European Union and rejoining the world, something for which I campaigned myself for decades and have not resiled at all from my support for that, though I recognize the perils in foreign policy terms of the United States gaining a 51st state called the UK after we leave the European Union. And that, with Donald Trump in charge in Washington, wouldn't be attractive to many British people. But a prerequisite for rejoining the world is that you make a serious effort to get on with the rest of the world, to minimize the number of enemies that you have in the rest of the world. The better to pave the way, not just for trade, though that's vitally important, not just for investment, though that too is important, but on the human level of cultural and friendship level, it's vital that Britain plays a new role independent of the United States and independent of the European Union, though of course our policies will overlap with one or both very often indeed. Britain hasn't made a great start to that. We're partly handicapped, in my view, by having Britain's Donald Trump as our Foreign Secretary. Boris Johnson's a kind of better educated Donald Trump. He can use longer words. He's got bigger hands. But he generally goes around the world like a bull in a china shop, knocking over anything that isn't nailed to the floor. And his diplomacy is highly flexible. For example, when he was a mere newspaper correspondent and a backbench Conservative MP, he strongly supported the Russian line in Syria. He strongly supported the Syrian government's attempts to smash Islamist extremism. He wrote many times about that, very expensively. He's Britain's best paid newspaper columnist. But as soon as he became Foreign Secretary, he volte-fast. He turned completely. He became an advocate of the worst possible relations with Russia. Now that would be bad enough if Russia were just a single country, but as Russia and China are increasingly joined at the hip, to be an enemy of Russia is to be an enemy of Russia and China. And on many other places, like Venezuela in Latin America, for example, Johnson and the British have gone out of their way to take the most hawkish possible line, which is not a good sign. It's not a done deal because he might be replaced by somebody better in the Conservative Party, or Britain may very well have a new government and an entirely different foreign policy. At least that's what I hope for. So we're looking today at where Britain stands in relation to the rest of the world. Of all the European countries, the British response to the massacre in Gaza was the weakest. The French government was the strongest. The German government not that far behind, quite surprisingly. But the British response of calling for restraint on both sides, as if unarmed demonstrators walking towards a fence have the same ability to exercise restraint as the people who are shooting them down with high-powered rifles. She did call, Theresa May, for an investigation into the circumstances that led to the massacre in Gaza. Not something she was interested in doing when it came to the Syrian chemical weapons attack alleged in Douma. Then there was no need for any investigation. In fact, there was no need to wait for the investigation to even arrive there to begin its work before a military response was launched. There was no need for an investigation before she blamed Russia for the poisoning attempt in the Skripal case in Salisbury. Then again, a rush to judgment and a rush to action guided her. The situation in the Middle East is, of course, not complete without talking about Iran, which isn't in the Middle East, but is, of course, extremely important in the region. On the unilateral wrecking of the Iran nuclear agreement, again, the British response has been the weakest of the European responses. The British have said they're staying in the deal, and Boris Johnson has made it clear that he thinks Donald Trump has made what he calls a mistake, as if he'd stubbed his toe or knocked over a piece of China rather than a deliberate wrecking move vis-à-vis the Iranians. But of all the European countries, Britain seems to me to be least likely to act on their words. Because think what the words mean. They mean that the other parties to the Iran nuclear deal will not accept the American attempt to wreck it. That means they'll have to support their companies continuing to do business with Iran. They'll have to continue importing Iranian products, particularly oil, and they'll have to continue paying Iran and Iranian companies for that trade. But Donald Trump has threatened punitive sanctions against any company anywhere in the world continuing to do business with Iran. That would pose the basis of a very considerable crisis between European governments and the American government. So that's the backdrop. It's a crossroads. Will Britain follow an independent foreign policy, or will we end up out of the European Union and out of the world? We've got this evidence-based audience here, many of whom are experts, some of whom are merely enthusiastic amateurs. The first expert is an up-and-coming young journalist in Britain called Patrick Christys. He's everywhere now in the media, as well he should be. He's going to be really famous one day, especially if I keep praising him in the way that I do. Patrick, where do you think British foreign policy stands?
Well, I think actually, and historically, it's been pretty poor. I mean, we've not exactly got a best track record, have we? In fact, I was having a chat in the office the other day, and I had to think maybe back to the Falklands before I thought I agreed with something overtly that we'd done. And even then, you can argue we've made a catalogue of errors that led up to it. I think that Britain's got a habit of rushing in to interventions and having no afterthought whatsoever to what the consequences of that are, the reality of which, of course, is a gaping hole that is filled often by terrorist organisations or certainly an absolute loss and breakdown of law and order. And I think that that's something that we need to change. I think post-Brexit, I would argue that we really need to move away from any idea of military intervention whatsoever and look to actually economic intervention in various countries. So we've got the Commonwealth nations there. Now, I would argue that we should maybe leave the Middle East a bit to whatever the Middle East wants to do. And we should be maybe focusing on the ex-Commonwealth countries, a ready-made network of nations there, and focus not on military things, not on intervention that's purely for self-serving ends, but actually go there and try to boost economically those regions. We've got historic allies there, and we should be focusing on them as opposed to maybe meddling a little bit in nations in the Middle East. As we saw
well, not just a little bit, is it? No. Britain and America invaded and destroyed Iraq, and thereby made Iran much stronger, and we're now aghast at how strong Iran is, broke Iraq into pieces, set up the forces in motion that produced ISIS and the disastrous carnage that they have created across the world. Britain and France led Obama, indeed pushed Obama, into the destruction of Libya, which is now 4 countries, a gaping hole through which much of Africa is headed for the European continent. Britain has been one of the most belligerent in Syria. How likely is it that the government we have will unlearn the lessons of all of that string of catastrophes?
Not at all, because in my opinion, these weren't little mistakes. There was almost an element, and the cynic in me would say it was almost an element of it being deliberate, because if you squash these countries in the way that we've done or make them completely unstable, you stop them all being functioning nations. That means that they can't thrive economically, and that means that Britain's position in the world is reinforced. We are on top of them. And so why on earth would a government want to change that? So no, they should want to change it, but I don't think they will. And so that's realistically, I think, why we've led up to this position, and I don't see realistically that we're going to end up changing that with this government. And frankly, if Theresa May's too weak to sort her own cabinet out, what do you expect us to do in the Middle East?
It's true that Britain has a vast Commonwealth because it had a vast empire. And it's true, I believe, that we owe that Commonwealth some reparation for the wealth that we took from them. But many of the countries of the ex-Commonwealth, the ex-Empire, now Commonwealth, not all of them are yet back in the Commonwealth, are themselves rising economies. So the basis exists for a new British role in the world. India, for example, which Britain governed for well over a century with 60,000 public servants, is now a mega hyperpower in the world with an economy that in the next 20 years will be bigger than any European economies. South Africa is also a sleeping economic giant. Do these countries want a special relationship with Britain, would be an obvious question. Or do they see their main relationships lying elsewhere?
I think that time's running out. I think certainly we have this historic relationship with them, and actually I think that a lot of these countries do have a slightly more romantic vision of Britain than maybe the Brits themselves have. And so yes, I do think that is still an option, and one that we should try and act on quickly before it runs out. So yeah, I do. The only risk I would say is potentially Boris Johnson, because although yes, I might have agreed with him over Brexit, although I wouldn't have maybe slapped what he did on the side of a bus, but I think the risk is he's always only ever a few seconds away from putting his foot in his mouth and potentially massively offending vast swathes of the world. And if we have got him as our envoy across the world, then you are maybe only a few seconds away from a diplomatic incident. And if we are on the brink at the minute, as we are, of needing or certainly wants to reshape our economy globally, is he someone that you want to necessarily be sending out there to do all your bidding for you all the time? I'm not sure.
He's only minutes away often from being dismissed, isn't he? He's openly challenging the Prime Minister. It's her weakness only that allows him to continue in his position.
Yeah, I think he was initially given the job to be given enough rope to hang himself with. And unfortunately for Theresa May, over the last period of however long it's been now, she's become weaker and weaker and weaker, and she's come into a position where no matter what he does, she can't sack him. And so she's just left with you know, this gaff-prone Boris Johnson sat there in cabinet actually wielding quite a lot of power now. And so that plan hasn't really worked out for, has it? Yes, in any other government, and I think the initial plan definitely was for him to not probably be Foreign Secretary now, and for him to quite possibly have left under a cloud and have been quite discredited. That simply hasn't happened, but neither is a lot of what Theresa May has maybe set out to do in the first place anyway.
Well, lastly, Patrick, you and I were on the same side on the Brexit affair. I think we'd both agree it's not going very well. Are we really going to leave the European Union is a question I must pose to you, because there isn't a majority for it in either chamber of the British Parliament. And the deal that Theresa May brings back may be such that it fails to pass, as the Parliament now has the final say on the matter. And where would that leave us? Would that leave us in the European Union? Or would it leave us out of it without any agreements? Or would it lead to another referendum? Could it lead to the collapse of the government and a new general election?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, all of those things are a possibility, aren't they? I mean, I think realistically, and it's very unfortunate as far as I'm concerned, I think we are sleepwalking towards a situation where we are able to say we've left the European Union, but in reality, we've not. And we've certainly not left the European Union with any of the significant benefits that I believe that a full Brexit could bring. So, yeah, and I think en route, we could well see, as you said, Theresa May not get her proposals, and they're quite weak as far as I'm concerned anyway, through Parliament. That would cause some kind of constitutional crisis, so therefore you could see a general election. Now, you might not have a second referendum called, and an overt second referendum, but a general election could be done on the terms of the Brexit deal, which is, for all intents and purposes, a second referendum. And, well, the result of that, we will have to wait and see what that would be.
Well, indeed. Robert, what do you think the result of that would be? Or do you think even that Patrick and I are on the right track?
Well, the result of another referendum would be to completely alienate the British people from the political class. They've seen that they voted for Brexit. The opinion polls showed that most people, whether they voted Leave or Remain, wanted out of the European Union, wanted the government to complete the task of taking us out of the EU. Of course, what's happening is that the government is seeking to keep us in name only. Of course, technically, we may well be out, but of course we would be aligned to the European Union's trade policy, its regulatory policy, defence and foreign policy, as well as a whole host of other areas, and still tied into giving the EU billions. And the British people will be absolutely thoroughly disgusted. And this is actually a great danger to our democracy if people are going to be completely ignored. And I think people would vote again to leave, but of course politicians will be playing with fire, and I can't overestimate this, overemphasise it, how disgusted they will be with what is happening at the moment. People already are, but also with the future, and they think they won't be able to trust politicians in this country any longer, even if they had trust in the first place.
This Brino, Brexit in name only, it's like a rhino in the room, because actually most of the political class either don't want to exit the European Union at all, or if they must, they want it to be where we are still in a customs union with the European Union. We're still, in many cases, in a single market with the European Union, requiring us to continue to accept unlimited European immigration into the country and so on. These seem to me to be the only two possibilities that could get through the British Parliament at this time.
Well, it would be the worst of both worlds. You know, we would be outside of the European Union technically and legally, so we wouldn't have the influence. But in terms of the EU developing rules, but we'd be handing over our fishing waters, allowing them to continue fishing and destroying our fishing industry, which has happened over the more than 40 years of membership. Things won't really have changed. We won't have the influence. We'll just be accepting European Union rules, accepting, as you said, immigration from the European Union without having any real say in how things are actually managed. And this is actually going to be very costly for Britain, and this will continue for the transition period, but after that, it could well continue for quite some time. Is that really there is an elite here that wants us tied into the European Union, wants us tied into these structures, and are really riding roughshod over what the British people voted for and what you campaigned for yourself,
Just
George.
For the international viewership of this programme, who might not be aware that the entire citizenry of the European Union, who are overwhelmingly white Europeans, by the way, are entitled at will to come and live here, work here, set up home here, push down wages here, drive up rents here, and put pressure on public services here. That's the reason, that's the main reason, isn't it, why the British people wanted to leave the European Union.
Well, the main reason was to take back control, so we would run our own affairs. Immigration was a big cause, because there's areas that have been blighted economically. As you mentioned, people's wages have been pushed down, social services have been, doctors' services have been pushed up, the demand for that through more people coming. So really it's been...
And with a housing shortage, rents are an absolute crisis in parts of this country.
Absolutely, it's been an absolute disaster.
It's not rocket science. Yeah. If there's a lot of people looking for a few houses, the price goes up.
Yeah, and people's wages have gone down and cost of living has gone up. And really this is something that's been driven... that's made Britain a cheap labour economy. People, it's low productivity, because a lot of these jobs that are created are low productivity. Companies don't have to invest in tooling or in new technology because...
cheap labour takes the
and it's all in the benefit of a very few people. Those at the top benefit from this, and the economic data shows those at the most wealthy benefit from this, but those at the lowest income spectrum
and that's how the vote went, didn't it? Most poor people voted to leave the European Union, and most rich people voted to stay in it. Again, it's not rocket science.
And it is actually a process that's helped corporations. It's actually caused a great deal of damage in Eastern Europe. They're devoid of young people, and those countries are really in doubt.
Not just Eastern Europe. If you go to Portugal, all the men are working somewhere else. It's like a land with no men, south of Lisbon.
No man's land.
Sorry?
No man's land.
No man's land. I wish I'd said that. We'll be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing Britain's role in the world. We've been talking about Brexit and Boris Johnson. We took the كلمة camera onto the streets of London to ask people if they thought Boris Johnson was doing a good job and how the British government was delivering Brexit.
Do you think that Boris Johnson is doing a good job as Foreign Secretary?
If the Foreign Secretary's being a clown in public, then yeah, he's doing quite well. Otherwise, he's a bit of an embarrassment to the nation.
Boris Johnson as a London mayor was very vocal, but as a Foreign Secretary, I don't think anyone really knows he's a Foreign Secretary in London, so absolutely not, no.
Who's that then?
Boris Johnson?
Yeah, he's all right. I like his hair.
So, are you familiar with Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary?
No, not so familiar from the Foreign Secretary, but I didn't like what they do about the international policies, no.
I'm surprised that he's still in the role, to be honest, and I don't know, he's a joke, and I think other countries see that. And it makes the whole of May's administration just seem questionable, to be honest, so yeah.
Do you think that our foreign policy at the moment is very ethical?
No, but foreign policy is never ethical. It's impossible to have an ethical foreign policy because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So, yeah, it's not. It's not, because we're sitting there retrospectively doing action and waiting for people to commit atrocities to then go out and intervene. But we'll be strung up just as much if we went out and preemptively went into places anyway.
It can't really be an ethical foreign policy when you look around the streets of London and see the amount of people that are living on the streets, homeless, scrounging around. I mean, you've only got to look around the local streets and you can see that it's not ethical. The whole world's not ethical as far as I'm concerned. So.
I don't think the UK's any foreign policy the UK's had could be regarded as ethical. I mean, from the time of empire building to the present day, it's a bit of a dubious relationship with many countries and trade agreements as well. No, I don't think it's ethical in any shape, manner or form.
So do you think that the UK's foreign policy is ethical?
No. I think that it's not any ethical, no, at all.
common sense, I thought, on the streets of London. I know that the Foreign Office watches this programme. I do hope they draw it to the attention of the Foreign Secretary. The only good thing anyone had to say about him was that they liked his hair, if he brushed it, maybe. Let's explore further with you, sir. What's been unethical about British foreign policy, and what would therefore an ethical foreign policy look like in your view?
Yes, my name is William Spring. I'm a director of a trade union called Employees Representatives, and also I do journalistic work. Now, regarding the ethical foreign policy, that's a red herring, really, from the days of Robin Cook, who mysteriously died on top of a mountain.
Yes.
In Wales.
Although even he didn't say we'd have an ethical foreign policy. He said there would be an ethical dimension to our foreign policy, which isn't quite the same thing. Well, anyway, even that didn't happen.
No, it didn't. And immediately after he said that we'd have an ethical foreign policy, Tony Blair, his boss, launched Britain into a series of wars.
Yes.
The first one being against Yugoslavia.
Yes.
Which they dismembered, and they killed loads of children at Gadelica Gorge and bombed Belgrade for 78 days and nights. A dreadful situation.
They even bombed the Chinese embassy.
Yes, and
they
the
bombed
Chinese
Serbian TV, Yugoslav TV.
Yes, yeah,
they killed the tea ladies.
Yes.
That was very ethical,
and that was
wasn't
defended by Tony Blair in the House of Commons. So I just feel the ethical foreign policy was never, ever actually produced by any of the Blairite ministers who've, will go down to a dreadful hell of permanent destruction and everlasting torment for the wars.
God willing.
Yeah, God willing. For the wars that they have created throughout the world. Because after Yugoslavia, remember, Iraq, how many dead?
Well, some fools supported the Yugoslav war. I was one of those who opposed it in Parliament, along with the great Mr. Benn, under his leadership. And we told everyone that this Yugoslav war will merely be the first stepping stone to a series of wars on the same basis of so-called humanitarian intervention.
Yes.
And if you support this war, you will not be able to stop them when they come on to the next one. And that's what happened, isn't it?
And they defend current wars by reference back to the Yugoslav war.
Yes.
They say, we must do a Kosovo.
Yes.
Kosovo was...
Although there is a very important difference. You'll recall Mr. Blair standing in the Kosovan refugee camps saying quite correctly that the Kosovan refugees have an inalienable right to return to their homes. But no British Prime Minister has ever said that about the Palestinian refugees.
No, quite. And that's, of course, in the middle of May, we saw this terrible situation on the border of Gaza. These people who were killed were not even in Israel. Now, you and me, George, I'm old enough to remember Sharpeville.
Yes.
And that was the
moment.
This
was in South Africa when so many civilian people were gunned down. That was a turning point, wasn't it?
That was the moment Britain lost, or the South Africans lost Britain. And before that, we had another massacre in India, Amritsar, where we lost India because of General Dyer opening up on a whole load of Indians at the stadium there. And we never learn a lesson. And this, whereas Sharpeville was only in the newspapers, this massacre committed by the Israelis was fully advertised all around the world with continuous TV coverage.
So you don't sound hopeful that Britain, out of the EU, will be able to find a foreign policy groove? I am myself still hopeful of that, but you don't sound so.
I think once we leave, but we have to leave. And, the process of getting out of this ruddy club is terrible. I mean, it's like leaving a nightclub and being trousered by,
Well,
for all
I've
your
never
money.
been in a nightclub or been trousered, so I'll have to take your word for that.
We shouldn't be having to do all this.
No, but if you think about it, we'll be starting, or ought to, with a clean sheet. We can make an entirely new role for ourselves in the world as the centre of the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Talking with, trading with all manner of people, not being bound by, for example, sanctions on Russia. Why should we sanction Russia? It's an opportunity for us. Russia is, especially with its alliance with China, that's where it's at. That's where most business is going to be, most trading, most potential investment, and return on our investment.
Yes.
It just doesn't make sense to be enemies of these people.
Not at all.
When they bear no ill intention towards us.
As Holy Mother Russia has done all it can to stop terrorism in Syria, especially Christians being executed and beheaded.
This
the
is
British
a very
government has
extraordinary
done
thing.
nothing.
It's a very extraordinary thing. Patrick, maybe you could comment on it. Boris Johnson used to say about the Christians being massacred in Syria, about holy places being desecrated, about the danger of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their throat-cutting mentality. And yet, the British government continues to this day to provide Air Force support and propaganda support on a gigantic level. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't quite get my head around it. I think it maybe ties into this thing at the minute in British society where we're almost ashamed of traditional Christian culture in Britain, you know, and we're a lovely multicultural country, absolutely, but historically, originally, we're Christians. So, but I can't get my head around this, you know, why aren't we more outraged, you know, with these massacres that have happened, even with things like the Yazidis as well, you know, there wasn't this mass outrage that went on there, you know, why not? Is there anyone who's being murdered or persecuted on any religious grounds whatsoever is an absolute outrage, and we should all be standing up unified against it. I mean, crucially, I suppose the real reason is money, isn't it? Are we not making some form of money over military action over there?
Probably, yes.
You know, I mean, I think we sell arms to the Saudis and help rebuild schools in Yemen. So, I mean, that's very much the British policy, isn't it, really? Unfortunately.
Perfectly expressed. Who'd like to come in? The gentleman behind you, yes, sir.
Yes, well, I think that, and I'm not saying the onus is on the Commonwealth countries except Britain to recognise this. I think it's Britain's obligation to convey to them this, that Brexit is not this does not have to be this neo-colonial project where Britain tries to, you know, try and gain control of the affairs of other countries by having an aggressive foreign policy.
I don't think India will allow that.
No, I know, of course. But my point is, if Britain conveyed to the Commonwealth countries the benefits of actually trading with them as a country that's leaving the EU, because the EU imposes import tariffs on any country that's not in it, including poorer countries.
All these liberals that support the EU don't seem to know that. They don't seem to know that the poor world is completely locked out of the European Union, can't get its goods into the European Union because of European Union tariffs. It's painted, isn't it? It's painted like the EU is some kind of liberal paradise, and those of us who want to be outside it are outright reactionaries, racists even. Sorry, go on, I interrupted you.
Yeah, but I think that, you know, if Britain said, you know, it's actually, well, it's cheaper, I think, for Britain to trade with the Commonwealth. I'm assuming that there would be a degree of reciprocity there. But the point is, if Britain conveyed to the Commonwealth countries that the EU is what is actually locking them out, not and severed Britain from, you know, the Commonwealth countries' abilities to trade with them. I think hopefully a lot, not all Commonwealth countries, but a lot of them, I think, would recognise that, and it's actually an opportunity for Britain to atone for its misdeeds by investing in them, by giving them more foreign aid, by trading more freely with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of foreign aid myself, and many of these countries don't need foreign aid. What they could do with is services from us. We still do some things very well. Patrick was correct earlier when he says that actually our reputation in Commonwealth countries is much higher than it should be, much higher than it ought to be. But as long as it is high, let's capitalise on that. Our language, for example, is, I believe, our greatest asset. Why aren't we teaching English everywhere that we can do so, investing in that, and thereby creating a cultural connection between other countries and us? One of my long parliamentary fights was against cuts to the British Council. I mean, I used to be approached by people all the time in travelling abroad, by people telling me that they so wished they could get their little Johnny into the English language class in the British Council, but couldn't because it was heavily oversubscribed. Well, why didn't we make more of them? More
EU.
classes. Yes, thanks very much for that. Let's take the lady at the back.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment on a point you just made there about teaching the world English. Just remember that the British government was teaching English or providing training materials to the Burmese army all those years while the Rohingya crisis was going on, and refused to stop funding them, even under a lot of pressure. So, and I think also when we're talking about ethical and unethical British foreign policy around the world, I think people think of unethical as dropping bombs, or Iraq, which was completely unethical. Over 1.5 million people lost their lives, and even after an inquiry, no one's ever been held to account. But also to remember that what a lot of us would regard as unethical British foreign policy is actually putting sanctions on civilians in Syria. Syria produced most of its own medicines, putting sanctions which affect those civilians, actually censoring Syrian media, so stopping actual Syrians, 23 million Syrians, from having their say, and actually only televising the Syrians they choose to televise, most of whom are outside the country, because they won't ever go in usually, and as they won't hear the rhetoric they want to hear, basically. And also the propaganda that they are putting. Those are all unethical British foreign policies.
Well,
and they're all
listen,
part of the
thought.
propaganda
Hold that
machine.
Thought, because I'm going to come back to you after the break, because I'm very interested in what you've got to say, but I've run out of time in this segment. We'll be right back.
لماذا يعمل البعض على استثمار أهل السنة والجماعة في الصفقات الدولية والأجندات المضادة للعرب والمسلمين؟ من يمثل حقيقة أهل السنة والجماعة ومن يمثل مرجعيتهم؟ كيف برز مصطلح أهل السنة والجماعة في التاريخ الإسلامي وكيف تطور؟ من يمثل أهل السنة والجماعة؟ عنوان برنامج ألف لام ميم يأتيكم الخميس الساعة 9 مساء بتوقيت القدس الشريف.
You're watching كلمة on الميادين television with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, and unusually discussing London, discussing Britain at this crossroads as we prepare in a matter of a couple of 100 days to leave the European Union. And what will our foreign policy be then? As I said, we had the camera out on the streets asking about various aspects of British foreign policy. Let's see more of what the people said.
How do you feel about the recent attacks on Syria led by the UK?
It just seems like a whole propaganda thing to make it seem that, yes, we're doing the right thing, but I think that there is a lot of corruption that they're not telling us, that is the reason why these sort of proxy wars are still happening. It hasn't been solved. So yeah, I don't think it was the right decision.
I don't know if they're justified. And I'd like to have seen a process done on that and a parliamentarian vote put to the people, or put to the representatives of the people of the country. That part wasn't taken, so no, I can't agree with that at all, I'm afraid to say.
And how do you feel about the UK's most recent attacks on Syria?
I'm feeling bad indeed, because I don't like war. Yeah.
No, but that's because they've waited too long to do anything. If they were going to get involved in Syria, they should have done about 4 or 5 years ago, when everything kicked off, and it should actually have been useful, instead of turning up a bit late to the party.
bombing of Syria has anything to do with the Salisbury poisoning?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I don't know if it's too much of a stretch to say that there maybe is some connection, but I don't know. It could be, but I don't know.
I think that was quite fortunate for both the UK and for the Russians. I think it allowed President Putin to reinforce the vote in Russia, and I think it gave the British some decent publicity as well. Whether it was linked with the attack in Syria, I'm not entirely clear.
Well, again, quite a lot of, scepticism, to say the least, about British foreign policy. Madam, you have the floor. You were talking about the monstrosity, I would say, of British policy towards Syria when we should have been supporting Syria and its allies in destroying people that almost everyone agrees are an existential threat to every society, our society, Muslim society, ISIS, Al-Qaeda and the rest. And yet we ended up on the side of the terrorists. Please continue.
And some of the comments that we just saw shows that the misinformation...
it works.
It completely works, because actually the gentleman who said we were slightly 5 years late to the party, actually we're not, because if he has a job, a portion of his tax is going on supporting terrorists in Syria. But again, that misinformation doesn't work.
Well, some new information on that has emerged in the last couple of days. Most people know, who are interested, which isn't, of course, most people, that we have been supporting the so-called White Helmets, Jamboree, the ambulance squad of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And now it emerges that the so-called Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which was run by a man in a council house above a shop in Coventry, but sounded and read like it was on the ground in Syria, has received almost £250,000 in the last year from the British Foreign Office. How's that for ethical, independent foreign policy reporting?
Doesn't surprise me. I knew he must be earning lots of money. And I think just the fact that he goes under the name of Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, I mean, people, again, that's misinformation that people then tend to think, oh, it's a big organisation, they're based in Syria. The truth is, you will not hear information coming out of Syria unless, and most of the White Helmets stage their operations outside of Syria. There's never any evidence of what is happening inside. Complete misinformation.
But didn't he take care of that? It was a strategy. ISIS and Al-Qaeda murdered every Western journalist they could get their hands on.
Yeah.
They cut their heads off on video. So no Western journalist could therefore go. So therefore you were reliant on them. The people who cut the heads off the actual journalists, they became the journalists, telling us what we wanted to hear. And we were paying them to give us that misinformation. How's that for a perfect circle?
And you hear about journalists, some journalists have actually said that they were, sort of coerced into going into areas which were dangerous, where they ended up in quite dangerous conditions. And most who do, and a lot of them did cross the border illegally, as did John McCain, but that's another story altogether. That's going off British policy. But I think it's important to realise that Syrian media, whenever you see someone Syrian speaking on TV, Syrian media is censored. And if we as a country promote free speech, as when I'm speaking about as in the UK, if we're meant to be promoting free speech, then why on earth are we censoring Syrian media all over the world? Why on earth are we not giving people on the streets of Syria the chance to have their say?
Yeah.
You're clearly afraid of what they're going to hear.
Huge crowds carrying Assad's picture and so on.
But you'll never see them in the media. No.
You never hear them. I'd like to hear. I mean, because I could make up my mind in a couple of minutes whether that person wanted to be there or had been pressed to be there. I would know from what they were saying and how they were saying it. unfortunately, I never get to hear them. Thank you. Have you got a last point you want to make?
I just want to say 23 million Syrians have the right to decide their own future without interference from the UK.
Well said.
And just quickly, just one last thing on the topic of nuclear. We were talking about nuclear weapons in Iran. Just to remember that the UK tested nuclear weapons on their own serving British military over 60 years ago. Subsequent generations have suffered many health defects, and the MOD and the British government have always refused to acknowledge that. So there's a lot of, when the British government are talking about their own soldiers, just remember there's quite a few soldiers out there who are still waiting for justice.
Well, this brings us in a way to the Skripal poisoning issue, because the tests were carried out by Porton Down, which is 6 miles away only from where the Skripal couple were attacked in the most mysterious, mystifying, bewildering circumstances on which no light is currently being shed. Just as an example of censorship, no British media are now able to discuss key aspects of the Skripal Salisbury poisoning affair because they've had what we call a D notice placed upon the story. And now it hasn't been given to me because they know I would go to Trafalgar Square and read it out in front of anybody who was ready to listen. And therefore, I'm the only person in British mainstream media currently discussing the Skripal poisoning affair. So they were in a bind with me. But every other journalist has accepted it. It's not being discussed anywhere at all, just for the international viewers.
And also, just to add, up until at least 1983, Porton Down were testing sarin gas and other chemical weapons on British serving military. So it's a whole shroud of mystery, as they like.
Yes. Thank you for that. Let's take the gentleman at the front.
Hi, George. Just to say, ethical foreign policy in Britain, the BBC is the major broadcaster. What probably people around the world don't know is that we're being misinformed by the BBC. The BBC World Service is funded by the Foreign Office to the tune of £300 million since 2015 and will be reviewed.
Just for the international viewers, the Foreign Office is like the State Department. It's the foreign policy wing of the British government.
Yep. And every one of our foreign secretaries and ministers for the Middle East, as we're talking to a Middle East audience, are members of their respective parties, Friends of Israel, which is something which is presented a problem for the Labour Party here. But going back to the information that we receive in Britain, so if you talk about the D notice for you on the Skripals, there's something called the Conflict, Security and Stability Fund, which is a Foreign Office committee which distributes money to basically propagandise the British cause wherever we happen to be. And the BBC is in receipt of this money. The BBC won't tell a fair story on Venezuela because we have a dog in this fight in Venezuela. We want the Venezuelan quote-unquote regime to change. We have a dog in this fight in that we want the Syrian quote-unquote regime to change. None of these places have governments if we don't like that. And the BBC, which does have a good reputation, it was, for many of the light entertainment and comedy programmes over the years. But in terms of serious news, the government here has it in a headlock. The government's policy is to basically cut the BBC. It's an extra tax. There's zero government, zero taxes. We don't need to pay a BBC licence fee to pay for the BBC for the world. We've got a BBC licence fee, which we are required by law to pay. The coverage that the BBC provides is biased. It's the government. It's basically a stenographer for the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office policy is what we get to hear from the BBC. The reason when I listen to you on the radio, when I watch you on this programme, what I find interesting is, one of the things I found interesting is 18 of the 25 countries that Britain has sanctions on at the moment, we used to run. Now, I heard you explain this on the wireless, on the radio recently, and it shocked me. 18 of the 25 countries that we used to run in the Empire, former Commonwealth, former whatever, we have sanctions on. The people in Britain will never hear this. And the reason they won't is because the BBC is in a headlock with the government over its senior management are all appointees basically on a revolving doors with Rupert Murdoch's News International. So a former editor of the Times was head of BBC News. He appointed Laura Kunsberg and various correspondents who are in tune with government thinking. And if they're not in tune with government thinking, the BBC will be cut.
Well, didn't Noam Chomsky memorably say to a prominent BBC presenter, Andrew Marr, when Andrew Marr said, "I can say what I like on the BBC." And Chomsky answered, "That's because what you say, they like. Yeah. And if they didn't like it, you wouldn't be saying it. You wouldn't be here."
Exactly. British foreign policy is typified by a political presenter like Andrew Marr.
Well, let me tell you, I was at the Royal Albert Hall at the weekend. In my opinion, one of the most beautiful auditoriums anywhere in the world. Listening to the BBC's concert orchestra, one of the world's finest orchestras. Watching on a big screen, Planet Earth 2, made by David Attenborough, one of the greatest personalities in the world. A man who's devoted decades, more than half a century actually, to bringing us the story of the natural world. And I thought to myself, this is the best of British. This whole setup here, this magnificent BBC programme, this magnificent British orchestra, this peerless, matchless auditorium. And I thought to myself, if only all of our life could be like this. If only we could be proud of other things in our country in the way that any rational person would be proud of this. So from now on, I'm carrying that around in my head, because the British are a great people with great achievements, scientific, cultural, and other achievements. And if we could take that into the world, if you get my metaphor, if we could take what was in the Albert Hall last week out to the world, I think there'll be a lot of takers. I think there'll be a lot of customers. There'll be a lot of people saying, "I'd like to be a friend of that." Because I don't think that the United States could match that. And at least I'd be happy proselytizing for that kind of Britain. Sorry if that is a bit emotional. I'll be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from London and rarely discussing London and its place in the world, Britain and its place in the world, its foreign policy, and especially when we leave the European Union, as we're currently scheduled to do quite soon, though there's many a slip between cup and lip. Patrick Christie's, because you have to slip away, let me come to you next. Are you optimistic that we have the political class in Britain to rise to the challenge, to rise to the occasion? Do you think that on the horizon are a generation, perhaps a new generation of leadership that can make a good fist of Britain's future in the world? Please.
I don't think at the minute, very unfortunately, I don't think at the minute that we have got the political nous, because we're making a complete and utter mess of it as things go. If you can't even decide 2 years on from Brexit exactly what kind of customs arrangement that you might want, I don't hold high regard for how we're going to go and negotiate a new trade deal with China or something like that, and how long is that going to take us? I do believe that we have, as a population, the quality among us, the ability among us to go and do it. Absolutely. I think that's unequivocal. But unfortunately, not enough of them are finding their way into the decision-making powers and the corridors of power. And, I think that's something that needs to change. We have people who are too much about damage limitation and not enough about, right, let's actually grasp the nestle here. And
there's a lack of vision, isn't there? I mean, if someone had given me the job, I would have spent the last 2 years, as I just did about my Albert Hall thing, going around the country enthusing people about what our new future could be. But it hasn't been anything like that.
We're almost ashamed of it, aren't we? And it's keeping us in our cage. And I think, actually, Theresa May, being as weak as she is trying to push through a damage limitation strategy. She's trying to dampen people's expectations so that when the crushing reality of her mediocrity sets in, then people aren't going to be that disappointed. But actually, why not? Let's have a go. And I would rather us shoot for the stars and miss than not bother at all, personally. This is my view.
It's a very,
call
very
me an optimist. I can say that because I'm 26.
I wish you were in the political class. Robert, this is not a party political point I'm making at all. In fact, I see it across the benches. This weakness in our political class, this lack of confidence. I mean, I think a lot of the political class have no confidence that we can make it on our own, that we can make something better on our own than we have been able to do for the last 45 years or so in the European Union. Do you agree with that, and what can we do about it?
Well, has been this problem where they really don't want to be running our own affairs ourselves, making our own decisions. They've exported the rights to govern this country to the European Union in many, many areas, even including foreign policy, and of course have been tied to the most ridiculous disasters from the United States. And really, there has been a lack of vision, and there is also a lack of confidence. For me, it's like the England football team. This is quite relevant because we're approaching the World Cup.
Yeah.
Often I fear that they're too afraid of losing rather than having the desire to actually go out and win. They're thinking, we don't want to lose, rather than we really want to win. And there is this thing which has affected British life, and it's pervaded large parts of our society. Of course, I say that now England will probably go on and win the World Cup, which is in Russia, because of course Boris Johnson won't be going. So who knows?
It's lucky for the Russians and for the England football team that Boris Johnson is boycotting it. But it's quite a good metaphor, actually, that you have made. It's been a long time, this seeping lack of vision and confidence. And yet there are people like me who were alive when London was the centre of the world. The swinging 60s, swinging London. It was the era of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Carnaby Street and Mary Quant and all kinds of reforms and changes taken. And that was before we joined the European Union. Why can't we have Britain like that again?
Well, we can, George. We can. Britain has these creative industries, what you've talked about. We have unique skills. We may not be able to mass produce shipbuilding on a great scale, but what we have is the British people, our creativity, the English language. There are people within the UK, even within the British Parliament, who actually are outstanding, but of course they're continually shot down. If they have a view that's counter to the establishment, counter to the BBC and the government's narratives, counter to the Murdoch press, then they are shot down. Then you will know yourself how you've been treated when you have just been calling situations correctly time and time again. They will produce bogus arguments about links to other countries. They're even doing the same thing now with the rising star in British politics, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who you may not agree with on a whole host of issues, but is someone who has deep convictions, and they will try and do this. They're doing the same thing to Jeremy Corbyn, not a man I agree with on many issues. I actually have known him many years ago. We did charity work together. But they will try and destroy people who have something unique to say, something original to say, and that was not tolerated, and they will use every kind of underhand tactic to discredit people. They will play the man instead of the ball.
Yeah, another good football metaphor. And the result is what, in a memorable phrase, Patrick just called crushing mediocrity. And it's true, isn't it, that we're governed by quite crushing mediocrity.
Well, Theresa May, of course, some people call her Prime Minister Theresa May. Other people refer to her as Prime Middle Manager Theresa May. She's doing a very good job at dampening down expectations of Brexit and her own leadership. She's doing very well there. That's one thing she is succeeding in, and that's actually alienating all sides of the debate, whether that people were for Leave or for Remain. She's made nobody happy and managed to annoy everyone. Great success.
Very well put. Who else would like to come in? William, let me hear from you again, please. we are not spring chickens. We both remember better days for Britain in the world. How likely is it, do you think, that the new Britain, there you are, I've just coined a phrase, the new Britain can be a success and its foreign policy can be very different to the one that we've had?
I think if we have the human resources, I have to say, though, that I've got my own concern here, that we've lost millions of children to the Abortion Act over the years. Now, who knows what those children who've been aborted could have done? We don't know. All I know is that I'm not at all happy with the political class, as Robert Alds isn't either. We've lost people in the political class who've got the courage to say things. We remember people, whatever you thought of Michael Foot, whatever you thought of his leadership, he had the courage to say something. And these non-entities who are running this country have alienated not only their own parties, but the whole mass of people. Mm. Now, if Brexit is frustrated, I can see a really serious problem over the barricades in the street, I'm afraid. I think Mrs May is pushing things.
They're risking social peace in the country. Let's put a name on it. They are risking social peace in the country if they betray a decision of 17.4 million people.
Yes, there was never any question before the referendum that they would accept the referendum result.
No, it said so in black and white.
Yeah.
This is your decision.
Yes.
The government will implement whatever you decide.
Yes, and I don't know, in fact, why we've had all these negotiations. Years ago, I wandered in 1975, I wandered into the Greater London Young Conservatives meeting at Hastings, and the speaker was Edward Heath. And I said to him in a question, I said, look, what happens, Mr. Heath, once we've entered this wonderful union that you talk about, the common market, what happens if people change their mind and want to leave? He said, well, young man, obviously all we need to do is repeal the acts that put us in there. But that's not the case. We could have left 2 years ago. We could have started off as an independent country 2 years ago, again. And we've got to rebuild bridges to, for example, South Africa, New Zealand, all the countries we've betrayed over the years. We would not be here were it not for the New Zealanders, George. People like Air Vice Marshal Park. You know, they saved our country. And yet we, in 1975,
we just showed... You're talking about the Battle of Britain and the assistance
we just showed them the door.
We
showed them the door. We showed the Commonwealth the door.
Well, we slammed the door in their face as they left. And that's why I was asking the question earlier, whether we'll be welcomed back by people that we turned our back on for a great new future with Europe, which
I think the Indians will welcome us back, but
yes, although we'll have to give quite a few of them visas to come here, and I'm in favour of that too. When you were talking earlier about Michael Foot, I was thinking of a famous exchange with Greta Garbo, the actress, the American film actress, who someone said to her, "You used to be big in movies." She said, "I'm still big, it's the movies that got small." And the political class has got small. I mean, I was 30 years in the British Parliament almost, and when I entered it, there were 100 or more really big figures, like Mr. Foot, Peter Shore, Tony Benn, Heseltine, and many other figures on the other side. They were demonstrably, unarguably, a big political class. Many had fought in the Second World War. Many had run important companies. Many had been trade union leaders. And many had run big local authorities and so on. None of that is true anymore.
No.
If you need a magnifying glass to see the British political class nowadays. And so we're going to have to grow fast a new political leadership in this country. And we did before, at the darkest hour to which you referred obliquely. We had to, because the old order was leading us to defeat and destruction in the Second World War. And then a new leadership came forward and saved the country. I'm not sure that I can see, I can't see the Churchill anywhere on the front benches. Can you?
Well, I can only say that we must stand as a nation for our principles. I've been down, you know, one of the worrying things are buffer zones to stop people actually protesting or having any form of, you know, interchange around certain areas. And we need to remember that the freedoms of this country were fought for, and people sacrificed their lives to maintain them. And
let me take, it's very fine words. Is there anyone else who hasn't spoken who would like to speak? Yes, the gentleman there. Let's take a young man. Let's hear from a young man. We've had enough from the olds. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, George. Well, I just wanted to begin by maybe speaking about the language that we use when we talk about foreign policy, when we talk about a lot of things in this country. And I wonder if we'd be better served using not foreign policy as how we describe things, but foreign hypocrisy. I think we'd be better served as using that term in explaining how Britain treats the rest of the world. And a lot of times it seems to me that depending on whether it's a friend or a foe, we treat them very differently. I think we will know that going around. But it's very difficult for me, really, to look at foreign policy, British foreign policy especially, looking historically at World War II and the way that we're supposed to be fighting oppression and oppressive regimes. Whereas now it seems that we are the backbone for many of these oppressive regimes. And so I think a change in the language might help us understand what's going on in this country. So I would love to go to Oxford and change the dictionary a little bit and change the word foreign policy to foreign hypocrisy.
Well, look, hypocrisy is Britain's middle name, and we have to live it down. We're not called perfidious Albion for nothing. We committed many crimes in the world. But somehow, in many of the countries that we committed those crimes, there's still a lot of good feeling about us. And as Patrick Christie said, we better act on it before it entirely runs out. I often find myself in company in India, in Pakistan, and I'm the only person there against the British Empire. Trust me, I'm the only person there denouncing the British Empire. The rest are wishing it would come back. Now, of course, we don't want and can't to come back as an empire, but we can come back as a force for good. We can come back as an independent force for good, for peace and for justice, if we vote for it and if we can find leaders who can live up to it. Last word to you.
Well, I absolutely agree, and I think that's a lot of much of the reason why our parents decided to come to the country like Britain. And it wasn't just financial; it was a lot to do with the ethical standing that Britain has. And it's a shame that it's been eroded, and it's a shame in a way that we're being exposed to some parts of it in some parts of the world, and then if you're interested in news, interested in politics, you find the hypocrisy almost everywhere else. And that's a real shame. I think the media in this country and the politicians in this country are letting us all down.
I think that's a good note to end on. And of course, we're not the only country where that's true. Maybe you're watching us in a country where the political leaders are letting you down. Thanks for being with us this evening. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back for more كلمة حرة on Al Mayadeen television.